Yeah, the session is going to be recorded so that people who haven't been able to join can listen in on it afterwards. So look, thank you very much for taking the time out. I really appreciate it. It's a very important topic, and I think that's reflected in people's time input that they're putting into attending a session like this. So what I want to do this evening is just run through a little bit of my own background and the background to the governance review. Set out some of the process that we went through, some of the recommendations that are in the review, and then deal with some questions that have already come in from people in advance of the session, and also offer an opportunity for questions to be asked during the session by way of the chat facility that's available on Zoom. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a button for chat. And if you have any questions as we go, if you type in the question into the chat facility, then I'll deal with those questions as we get to them towards the Q&A part of this. So please feel free to input those questions at any point, and I'll get to them. So first of all, just give you a little bit of background in terms of my own background. Obviously, I work as a consultant in sport. I've worked with a lot of sports in the Irish setup. There's very few sports and NGBs that I haven't worked with in some capacity in terms of developing strategies, advising on governance matters, and supporting and kind of various different initiatives. Everything from boxing, obviously, to swimming, athletics, triathlon, soccer, rugby, cricket, gymnastics. I could go on. There's a lot of sports that I've worked with, so I know the Irish sporting landscape pretty well from a professional capacity. I've also been involved in sport myself for my whole life. Sport has been very influential in my life. From a young age, particularly in two specific sports, but I've kind of, as a volunteer, I've been involved, obviously as a participant, and as kind of a young person growing up in sport, as a player in various sports, as an underage coach in two sports. I've worked as an administrator at club level, serving on executive committees in my club. And also in high performance sport as a selector, a national selector in a sport, and I'm now actually a chairman of an NGB as well. So I understand the volunteer aspect of sport and the various roles that people play, because I've played all those roles myself, and it's given me an appreciation of what's involved, the time, the effort, the commitment that goes into being a volunteer in a sport. And I've personally benefited from sport and kind of what it's done for me in my life, and I've seen the positive impact that it has for a lot of people. So I really do understand and get the importance of sport, particularly in Ireland. I guess when it comes to boxing, I have a particular perspective on boxing on a daily basis up and down the island. There are any number of boxing clubs that are making a massive difference to people's lives, and it's really important to remember why this sport is so important for the benefit generally of Irish society. And in theory, my belief is that boxing should be one of the easiest sports to support in terms of investment, and because it's delivered long-term success, not just within the ring but also outside of the ring. So in the ring, it's Ireland's most successful Olympic sport, bar none. Over half of Ireland's Olympic medals have come through boxing, and we are consistently winning medals at world, European level as well in amateur boxing. So it's a kind of massive success story in the ring, and has been for a long time. It represents obviously both male and female, and we've seen some of the kind of inspirational characters on the female side of the sport in recent times that have really captured the imagination and hearts of the nation. But outside of the ring, I think it's even more important to acknowledge the social capital of boxing and what it brings in supporting various different communities. I think boxing reaches communities, very hard to reach communities that no other sport can access in the same way that boxing can. Marginalized communities, ethnic groups, traveling community, etc. That no other sport is reaching people in the same way that boxing is. And so for that reason, it should be a really easy sport to support and to back, and kind of that's the starting point for me in this governance review. It's why it's so important. But for various reasons, boxing is struggling to attract sponsorship. It's struggling to attract commercial partners, and it has its funding under threat from Sport Ireland, which is sad. A lot of the really good work that's being done up and down the island, and to some extent, is being undermined a little bit by perception of governance issues within the sport at regional and national level, and that's kind of served to erode the faith and trust that people have, some of the key stakeholders have, in their willingness to back the sport at the scale and the level that I think it should be backed. And it makes it very difficult for the sport to continue to grow and to prosper, if that is the case. For that reason, I really think it's important that boxing is a best-in-class organization when it comes to its governance model. It's got everything else. And if we can get the governance side of the sport right, and we can get people to have real faith, belief, and trust in the governance model, then that is the kind of final sort of element, if you like, that will really go to serve the sport in the longer term. It's really crucial in enhancing the reputation of the sport and building trust amongst key stakeholders that we get that right. And if we do, I have no doubt whatsoever that it will start to perform far better from a commercial perspective. It'll attract and retain people into the sport, and it'll serve the sport for kind of generations to come, and over both the boxers and the volunteers that are so passionate about the sport. So I think that's the kind of fundamental backdrop for the review, and why I think the review is so important. And I think if you look at the sporting landscape is a very competitive one, not just in the ring, but also outside of the ring, in terms of attracting funding, attracting sponsors, attracting people at local and national government level to get behind the sport in a practical way in terms of investment in the sport. And that's kind of really what's at stake here. In terms of the kind of the how the review came about, I think the review fundamentally came about because the board recognised the need to try and address the governance kind of perception that the sport has. The sport wasn't commissioned by Sport Ireland. It was asked for by the board itself. The chairman requested an independent review of the governance structures for the reasons that I set out, and that was the real kind of driver for the review. And it was kind of in recognition of the fact that whilst there's an awful lot of really good work has been done in professionalizing the sport, and a lot of the progress that's been made in the structures around the sport, and some of the reform that's happened with the rule book and other changes, there's a recognition that more work needed to be done on some of the processes and the underlying behaviors and culture to make sure that we had a fit for purpose governance model. And that was really the ask of the board when they commissioned the review. I suppose in terms of the review process itself, I obviously undertook the review. So in doing so, I looked at a lot of different things. I consulted as widely as I could. I offered the opportunity for everybody who wanted to participate and offer a viewpoint to do so. That obviously included members of the board, members of Central Council, the provincial boards, the staff within the IABA, other key stakeholders, including Sport Ireland and other potential funding partners at local and regional level, and I kind of canvassed their views and opinions, and out of all of that tried to get as comprehensive a picture as I could as to what people felt were some of the issues at hand and kind of what were potentially some of the solutions that might be put forward to try and deliver the brief, which really was to set out a new governance model that would kind of serve the sport into the long term, into the future. In terms of the findings, I probably kind of would characterize the findings of all of that research component and the various interviews and benchmarking that we did into 4 key elements. I think there was some stuff around culture and behaviors, where people were identifying things that they felt could be improved in terms of the underlying culture within the sport, and in particular, some of the behaviors associated with the governance model and governance structure. The second area was around the governance structure itself, the current setup of how the sport is administered, from the board through to central council and the various provincial and county boards as well, and viewpoints around that. I think the third area we looked at was the link and the relationship between the decision-making structures within the sport and the members, because fundamentally those decision-making structures are there for the exclusive purpose of serving the members, serving the people who volunteer day in, day out to run the various different clubs. And that link and that relationship, to some extent, whilst I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as broken, there is a kind of distance, if you like, between some of the decision-making structures and the kind of grassroots. And so looking at ways in which we can kind of try and closen the link and the alignment between the decision-making structures and the members is really important. And then the fourth area that we looked at was kind of around oversight and control, and making sure that things are done properly and there were good systems and processes in place to give confidence to all of the various different stakeholders in and around the sport, that things were in good order from that point of view. In terms of the recommendations, obviously there are a large number of recommendations that are included in the report, and many of them are fairly straightforward recommendations in terms of core principles around good governance practice, some of which are already in place, and others related to the structures and proposals for changes to the structures. So again, we've kind of organized the recommendations into 7 different categories. The first is setting out some kind of core principles, which are kind of, to some extent, motherhood and apple pie stuff around good governance practice, but nonetheless important to set out as a context for the overall structures. The second area of recommendations is around culture and behaviors, and addressing some of the underlying culture and behaviors that were identified by people as I interviewed them and as I spoke to them, and how we might kind of address some of those issues and concerns that people have. The third area was around the actual structures themselves. So the makeup of the board, the makeup of central council, and some of the structures associated with all of that. The fourth area was around the focus on grassroots and supporting the clubs and members in a more direct way, and making sure that funding and other practical supports are provided to the members. The fifth area related to high performance matters, and making sure that there's a clear link between the whole pathway from the very start, when any kid, boy or girl, enters a boxing club for the first time, and a link right through all of the pathway, ultimately leading into high performance and into kind of the Olympic realm, and making sure that that link is fully aligned right throughout, and no sort of kind of perception of a kind of an isolation of any element of the pathway. The sixth area was around one or two fairly straightforward recommendations around oversight and control, and making sure that the right kind of processes are in place in relation to that. And then finally, there was a kind of catch-all section around general actions to support a lot of the other stuff that was included in the various different recommendations. And so a number of recommendations at the end, which were designed to help support all of that. I would say, whilst obviously there's a lot of recommendations in the report itself, The most fundamental one is the reform of the structure of the board, and essentially the EGM on the 10th of July is asking members effectively to vote on that, on addressing the constitution and the makeup of the board. And if that passes, or if it doesn't, then all the other recommendations kind of fall out of that. So if that passes, then that provides the opportunity for a newly constituted board to look at the remainder of the recommendations and to determine what is in the best interests of the sport and the organisation, and to consider how they might go about implementing any of those recommendations and the pace and at which that might be done. So I think the really key point as far as what the members are being asked to consider for the 10th of July is that fundamental constitution and makeup of the board. And as I said, I think everything else will flow from that. I think in listening to some of the commentary from Sport Ireland and indeed the Minister as well, I think their viewpoint would be that that for them, that's the critical element of all of this, and that if that vote passes, then they would be very supportive of providing support and assistance to the IABA to help oversee and kind of support them in the kind of consideration of the rest of the recommendations and the implementation of those. So I think that's where the focus really should be in the lead into the 10th of July. I know that there's a lot of questions that people have asked since the review has been published, and what I'll do is address some of those questions that I'm aware of, and certainly more than happy to then, once I've done that, to open it up to everybody on the call to input any additional questions that they might have and to address those as best I can as well. So what I'll do now is kind of go through some of the most common questions that I've heard so far, and then, as I said, leave it open to anybody to ask any additional questions over and above those as they see fit. So one of the first questions that has been asked is in relation to the role of the president. So in the review, a recommendation is being made that the president will continue to be a member of the board, but not a voting member of the board. And there's a lot of people who are asking why that is and kind of what the rationale for that is, and where does that happen elsewhere, or is that very specific as a proposal to boxing? So if I deal with the first element of that, it's fairly it's practice that it's not uncommon. Indeed, there's a number of sports, and I'll go through some of the sports that have already moved to that model. And part of the reason that they have is that the role of the president is seen to be a role that represents everybody right across the entire sport. It's very much a critical ambassadorial role. It is one that, in theory, should be above the politics of the board and the kind of voting outcomes of the board, and that in doing so, that would provide a kind of almost like an arm's length relationship to the board, and keeps the president out of controversial matters or decisions of the board. There is in any board setup, there is a collective responsibility principle, which means that whenever a decision has been made by the board, irrespective of any individual viewpoint in relation to that decision as it's being made, and it's a very healthy practice for boards to debate vigorously any decisions that might be in front of it. Once a decision has been made by the majority of the board, then every board member is duty bound to kind of stand over that decision. And obviously, when it comes to the role of the president, there are some members who may agree with the decision that the board make. There are other members who may disagree with the decision that the board makes. And given that the role of the president is to represent all of the members, it puts the president in something of an invidious position in listening to the concerns and dealing with the members that are not in favour of any kind of individual decision that the board might make, because in theory, if the president has a voting role on the board, then the president is duty bound to stand over that decision, irrespective of their own individual position on that, and in particular, irrespective of the viewpoints of some of the members that don't necessarily agree with that decision. So it makes it harder for a president to fulfill that obligation of fully representing all of the members, and being open to and listening to the viewpoints of the members. And it also potentially creates something of a potential conflict in relation to the role that the president might play in central council. So if the president chairs central council, that then kind of may kind of set those two bodies kind of in conflict over any particular issue. And again, in that position, the president becomes somewhat compromised in having a voting role on the board. And so for that reason, very many NGBs, and in a lot of cases, they're moving towards this model where they try and prevent placing the president in at times that position where it makes it more difficult to represent all of the viewpoints and perspectives of the members. I think what's really important in doing that is not to take the president away from the board altogether. So what is regarded as best practice in those circumstances is to ensure that the president still attends all board meetings, has a strong voice in all of the discussions that take place in those board meetings, and is in a position to be able to and empowered to represent the members as best he or she can, to ensure all viewpoints are understood and represented in those discussions. And I think it makes it easier for the president to be able to fulfill that role in a more full way. And that essentially is the kind of the underlying rationale, if you like, for that particular recommendation. When you look at all the other sports in the Irish sporting landscape, Sport Ireland categorise NGBs in three ways. So they have a Type A, Type B, Type C categorisation in terms of organisations. Type A organisations are the smaller NGBs that are entirely volunteer-led and haven't kind of necessarily set up as a limited liability company and don't have any full-time employees, etc. Whereas on the opposite scale is a Type C organisation, which is an organisation that is where the board is has set up and a limited liability company is set up, and the board runs that, and they employ professional staff, which is what and how the IABA is regarded. And when you look at all the other Type C organisations in the Irish sporting landscape, the other ones that would qualify, and I'll leave some out, I'm sure, here, and when I kind of list these out. So you've got athletics, swimming, golf, tennis, hockey, cricket, sailing, basketball, badminton, gymnastics, rugby, soccer, and I'm sure I'm kind of leaving somebody out in that list. When we look at that, how many of those organizations have a similar structure in terms of the role of the president? And about half of them do. So in the case of athletics, of swimming, of hockey, of cricket, basketball, badminton, and gymnastics, they have all moved to a model where the president doesn't have a vote on the board, but does have some element of role on the board in terms of full participation at board meetings. One or two of those NGBs have gone as far as not having the president on the board at all, although I personally think that the president absolutely should have, in order to be able to provide that representation of the viewpoint of the members. So about half of the category C or Type C organizations have moved to that model already. And most of those are the ones that have undergone fairly significant governance reform of late, and many of whom are thriving from an external stakeholder perspective. And that's one of the factors that's at play. The other element that is in play there is also the presence of independent directors on the board. And again, many of those organizations have moved to a model where they have independent directors on the board. And again, that adds to the confidence and trust and standing, if you like, of those NGBs in the eyes of many stakeholders. So I think it's important to realize that. So boxing certainly would not, if they did adopt this recommendation, boxing would not be alone. In fact, they would be in the same category as many of the other really well-regarded NGBs from a governance perspective in moving towards that model. Another question that's been asked quite a bit is, why can't we just have boxing run by boxing people and not have any independent people involved at all? And again, I can understand fully, boxing has been around for a very long time. It's been a very successful sport for a very long time, and has been run by boxing people for a very long time. And so why change? Again, I think there's a couple of elements to this. One is that the sports that have started to introduce independent directors into the setup and kind of leverage the skill sets that brings have found that it's been very beneficial to them for a number of reasons. First of all, it introduces a whole cohort of people who are capable of providing skill sets that may not be necessarily accessible in the same kind of scale to the sport from within its own ranks. So what you need in an increasingly complex environment, particularly when you're a limited liability company, is to have a whole range of skill sets from legal and marketing and commercial and HR and finance and kind of various different other skill sets. So what it does is it opens up the field to have those skill sets, and also it enables not just that professional expertise and objectivity to be brought to bear, but also a sense of perspective, outside perspective, that can benefit decision making and open the sport up to new avenues. And kind of fresh thinking and bringing kind of different perspectives into play. And certainly the ones that have gone down that route, and I've seen this firsthand with a lot of NGBs that have done this, it really does add to the strength of the decision making within the governance structures and model. The other element of this is that it's very much the model that Sport Ireland are promoting, and so as the primary funding partner to sport in the country, it's a model that they are advocating and therefore one that needs to be very strongly considered. And I think the third element of this is it doesn't mean that we can't have and continue to have a strong presence of boxing people within the board and the decision-making structures within the sport. In fact, again, I would advocate very strongly that needs to continue to be the case. To my mind, the optimum model is to have a balance of people from within the sport and who understand the sport intimately, and people who bring fresh perspectives and bring independent perspective and objectivity, and also skill sets to kind of add to the existing skill sets of those already within the sport. So what I've recommended is kind of an even balance, if you like, between boxing people and kind of independent people to open the field a little bit more. In saying that, there is absolutely nothing to stop people applying for independent director roles on the board who come from a boxing background. So the idea would be that there is an identification of the types of skill sets that are required to have an adequately balanced board in terms of the expertise sitting around the table. And if that comes from somebody who is already within the sport, even better. So you get a combination of both. But the structure is designed to try and make sure that adequate balance of boxing people and independent people and skill sets is catered for by definition. So that's the kind of the perspective, if you like, in relation to that. Then if I look at kind of some of the other kind of questions, if you like, that have been posed, there is a question around how do people become members of the board? So how do you get onto the board? What I've proposed is that, first of all, that there is an independent body that helps oversee the kind of whole process. And why is that? And quite simply, it's designed to try and make sure that the process of appointment to various positions within the governance model doesn't become overly politicized. If it's overseen by an independent body with an expertise in the board recruitment, selection, and appointment, then that will add to the confidence and also the kind of perception of objectivity in terms of the kind of selection process. So what is proposed is that we look at potential organizations or bodies that might be able to perform that function. For example, the Federation of Irish Sport provides a service to NGBs around board recruitment, where it provides kind of advisory support, and it helps run some of the interview process that might go with that. And something like that can kind of work very, very well. There's other bodies like Board Match and the Carmichael Centre and kind of, who provide services like that. So the idea would be that they would assist in the process. They're not the final decision makers. Ultimately, the final decision makers are the members. So the board represents the membership, and therefore the membership have the final say on who becomes a board member and who doesn't. But what an independent body like this does do is assure that the process through which people are nominated for consideration at the AGM is a rigorous process that's fair, that's objective, and that it adheres to the kind of principles of good governance and tries to ensure that there's some element of balance and diversity within the board. So again, that's the idea of having a kind of some form of independent body assisting in that process. But to be very clear, they are not the final decision maker in who is or isn't appointed to the board. Does that independent body already exist within the IABA? No, it doesn't. So that's something that if the EGM decides to go ahead with the new board structure, then that's something that the new board would deal with and can look at in due course. In terms of how the position of the chair would be appointed, again, what's recommended is an independent chair. Again, that's kind of seen to be best practice in NGB governance. And so the idea would be that there would be an application process, an interview process, so it would be open to any candidates who feel that they have the skill set to apply. The independent body could oversee that kind of application process and kind of help manage and organize that interview process. And then the nominations committee that would be put in place could again be involved in that process to submit and review the kind of candidates and ultimately go through that kind of selection process. And then obviously, again, as with the board members, the position of chair then would be ultimately put to the membership at an AGM for final ratification. So the kind of chairperson wouldn't necessarily be handpicked, but would go through a fairly kind of rigorous and independently kind of supervised process, if you like, to ensure that that is done in a correct manner. Another question that's been asked is the current chairman eligible to become the chairman of the new board? In theory, yes, everybody and anybody could apply with the right skill sets. Although I suspect that if the kind of governance reforms are accepted, and then kind of there's an opportunity for kind of new people to be kind of appointed and put in place, but that's ultimately a matter for this board to decide.
Brian, if I might interject for just a moment, we have a question in the Q&A section which kind of relates to this particular topic.
Yeah.
So the question is, female representation in governance and board positions. Is there a set percentage to satisfy Sport Ireland in relation to future funding?
Yeah, there is. So Sport Ireland and the government have stipulated that by 2023, which obviously is kind of very is not too far away, By 2023, all NGBs need to have 40% gender balance on their boards. So that means that we need to have 40% balance of either obviously a minimum of 40% male or a minimum of 40% female representation on the board. At the moment, obviously, in boxing that stands at 0. So that's a fairly big task to move from now at 0 to 40%. And so that needs to be addressed in a number of different ways. The proposals around it kind of extending the size of the board and having more independent directors on the board is one opportunity to get female representation up quicker. So it's likely that there may be a bias, if you like, towards the appointment of female directors. But the achieving the 40% gender balance can't just come from the independent director route, because again, that closes the field to potential really good candidates who might express an interest to become an independent director. There's some of those slots need to come from within the sport as well. So what we've recommended to try and encourage that is that each of the nominees that come from within the sport, so what we're recommending is 4 nominees from each of the provinces, 1 from each of the province, and a coaching nominee, and also a kind of former athlete nominee, that in each of those cases that 2 people are put forward for consideration, 1 male, 1 female, and that provides us with an opportunity to address the gender balance and to be able to kind of try and identify potential candidates from within the sport as well as through the independent route, in order to try and meet that obligation, which is fairly onerous on getting to a 40% gender balance. So that's in part why some of those recommendations have been put in place. And I've also included in the recommendations some practical measures in the short term to try and increase the population of potential candidates. So I've recommended the establishment of a governance training program to be run, and over the next couple of years to get as many people through that as possible. But you could, kind of envisage a kind of program, and the similar programs that exist in other sports, where you might kind of train up, anything from a dozen to 20 people at a time on a program, and have maybe a bias towards kind of a younger generation and also kind of female representation on that training program, to try and increase the potential supply of people who might be eligible and have the right skill sets to become board members, both from within the sport and obviously as independent directors, if that's the kind of other route that's open. So I think that's an important, and that's going to be a very difficult challenge for the sport to go, as I said, from 0 to 40% in a very short space of time. So that's the some of the rationale for some of those are the recommendations in that space. And I hope that addresses the question. I think was it Brian that posed that question, so I hope, Brian, that addresses that question for you, and if not, please just come in and type in another question, and I'll deal with that. In terms of some of the other questions that have been asked, who will pick the independent directors? So again, that'll go through an application process that will be overseen by an independent body to make sure that the applications and that whole process is run in a fair way. They'll review those, they'll make recommendations, and those recommendations will be put to the members for voting and for ratification. And so ultimately, the final decision will be with the members, in the same way that kind of all of the appointments to the board are, because board directors, whether they're independent or representative from within the sport, are there to serve the members of the sport. Another question that's been asked is, in the new board structure, is it envisaged that the chairman will vote in situations other than he or she having to use their casting vote? Straightforward answer to that is yes. There is no restriction on the kind of chairman vote. Obviously, in the case of a a split vote, the chairman would carry the kind of casting vote. And again, that's pretty typical in board structures, not just within sport, but in the corporate world as well. The kind of simple, straightforward answer to that one is yes. In terms of will this, what impact will the recommendations have in relation to funding? Will more funding become available to the sport if the recommendations are adopted? Again, I think that the answer to this is yes, in a couple of different areas. So the first area is in relation to the state funding that's provided through Sport Ireland. I think we've all seen and heard some of the comments of the minister and the position that's been taken, which obviously is kind of a threat to the funding if the kind of EGM doesn't ratify the recommendation in relation to the board composition. But the likelihood is that if the recommendations are accepted, then that will open the door for increased funding. And a lot of that funding, so sometimes there can be a perception that, well, you know, not all this funding that goes into the sport, we at club level, we don't necessarily see the benefit of that funding. There's an awful lot of the funding that is given to the sport that has a very direct impact and influence on the sport at grassroots level. So, you know, if I take a very simple example of that, at the moment there is a funding scheme that is operating within the sport where some 259,000 euro is being invested in clubs all across the island as part of the capital funding programme from Sport Ireland. And that's a kind of typical example of some of the fairly significant and tangible funding schemes that are in place from Sport Ireland. We also saw through COVID a lot of the very practical funds that were made available to the grassroots of the sport. And again, I think that the kind of increased funding is much more likely from Sport Ireland in the context of a positive vote for reform and change. One of the other recommendations in the report is the establishment of a fund managed through the board but delivered by Sport Ireland to assist the clubs in relation to capital programs, provision of equipment and supportive facilities to make the clubs more sustainable. And again, that would be a very practical, direct implication for the clubs if this was accepted or not, as the case may be. The other potential route of additional funding is through commercial partners. So one of the consequences of the lack of confidence in the governance model and structures is that commercial partners don't invest in the sport in the same way that they do other sports, in spite of all of the positive elements of the sport that I talked about at the very outset: success in the ring and the social impact that the sport has outside of the ring, and the reach that it has in very hard to reach, marginalized and disadvantaged communities. That makes it a very attractive proposition. And part of the reason that it hasn't been attracting commercial funding and sponsorship and support is for the very reason that people just are nervous about the underlying governance model and the perception that they have around that. So I think a positive change in relation to the governance reforms that are being kind of outlined would be a very strong signal, and I think would result in additional funding from a commercial perspective, and then local authorities as well, likewise. So I think the consequences of an acceptance are not of the fundamental recommendation in relation to the composition of the board, will have a very significant impact, practical impact for all clubs in relation to kind of future funding. In terms then of another question that's been asked is who will oversee the implementation of the report, again to be agreed and decided. I think that from Sport Ireland's perspective, I think they are anxious to see how the EGM goes. If the EGM votes in favour of the reform of the board, then they will provide a lot of support, and I think will be a lot more kind of willing to work closely with the sport over an extended period of time to kind of oversee some of the other recommendations. I think that in the event of the vote not being successful, then I think they will go in the opposite direction, unfortunately, and it'll have potential kind of serious impact in relation to the existing funding that's there, and close doors into the future. Again, you know, another question that's been asked then, so who will oversee then the ongoing implementation beyond that? And again, that's something to be agreed, and I think that's something that, should the vote go in favour of reform on the 10th of July, then there, you know, an agreement would be put in place between Sport Ireland and the IABA as an organisation to determine the pace of change and the kind of oversight arrangements around the implementation of the recommendations beyond that. I'm trying to think of some of the other. One of the other questions is a 75% threshold required for at the EGM? My understanding is that is the case, because it represents constitutional change, and so that's a pretty high threshold, very high threshold for any sport, and so. There's obviously a very significant risk that some people will believe that that these aren't the right changes, and it may not carry. But my understanding is that that 75% threshold is in place. I think there was also a question in relation to proxies, and again, it's not my area of expertise, and Ciara can kind of confirm if this is the case, but my understanding is that all the clubs will be entitled to send 2 members to the EGM, one with a voting right, as it were, and so given that kind of there are 2 adult members as delegates, one voting, one non-voting, I don't think there's a provision for proxies at the AGM, but Ciara, you might be able to kind of shed further light on that one.
Absolutely. So there won't be a proxy vote in recognition of the fact that any club can send any 2 adult members. These don't have to be committee members to the EGM. They can nominate any adult member of the club as their voting delegate, and nominate any adult member of the club as a non-voting delegate. So I suppose traditionally, many clubs and many sporting organisations, in fact, would assume that their delegate at any event of this nature would have to be a secretary, or may have to be a chairperson or president. That isn't the case. As long as your club puts forth this adult member, that adult member, and they're registered, that adult member can vote on the club's behalf.
Thanks, Ciara. And another question that has been asked is the kind of makeup of the nominations committee. And I think there's a kind of general point that I would say in relation to kind of all the standing committees. I know that with the rulebook changes that took place in 2019, there's a big emphasis on the committee structure, and kind of, you know, the various different positions on the committee structures, and not all of those committees and the kind of positions on those have been filled and are operating in the way that kind of it was envisaged, and they'll have a big influence on what happens. So I think the makeup of those various different committees is kind of a matter for the sport to decide through its kind of various decision-making structures. Ultimately, I think if we were in the process of kind of setting up a new board, then there would be a need for kind of the establishment of a nominations committee in the way that it's outlined here, and that's kind of up to the sport itself to determine how it fills that nomination committee and the posts in there. But there's kind of some kind of principles that we've set out in relation to that. So I don't know if that kind of clarifies that particular one. After that, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think if I've covered all of the questions. Oh, there was one other question that came up in the previous session that we had, which was, can you have a rotating chair? So a year on, a year off, or 2 years on, 2 years off, with an independent chair, and then a person that is a boxing person. It's not something that we would recommend. You know, there's a continuity that is required in relation to the running of a board, and that can get kind of disrupted if there's a kind of rotation policy in that way. There's absolutely nothing to stop anybody from applying for the role of independent chair from within the sport, and you know, there's a kind of sort of role description the same way as any kind of job application process, and the idea would be that the kind of most qualified candidate would be the one that would be successful and would fulfill the kind of role profile, and so that's kind of open to anybody. But the idea of a kind of rotation, kind of year on, year off, 2 year on, 2 year off, is not something that we would advocate. It doesn't work in practical terms. So again, I think they're all the questions that I had seen in advance. I don't know if there's any other questions that people might have, but if they do, then I'm more than happy to answer them if you type in the question into the chat facility or into the Q&A facility. Happy to deal with any other additional questions that might be out there.
Just pause for a moment to give everybody time to formulate and then convey in their questions.
So I'm not seeing any questions coming in just yet. So what I might suggest is that there's at the bottom of the screen, there's also a raise hand button as well. So what I might suggest, if people have a question that they want to ask, if you type it into the chat or Q&A facility. If you're happy that there's no additional questions, you have you might press the raise hand button, and then we'll know that you don't have any additional questions, and we don't necessarily need to wait for the questions to come in if there are none coming. So if you don't have any additional questions, you might press the raise hand button. So I'm just looking. Okay, so I can see. Thank you, Gus. That's fine. Brian and Tom, I don't know if you have any. No, Brian, that's fine. Thank you. And finally, Tom, I'll just wait just in case there's any additional question you might have. No, doesn't look like it.
I don't think so either, Brian. It appears Tom doesn't have a question.
Okay. Okay, no problem. Look, thank you everybody for taking the time. I appreciate it's the evening time, it's your own kind of time. So I appreciate you coming onto the call and kind of listening to the kind of various different elements in the background. I understand how important this is, and I hope I've been able to kind of address any of the questions and provide enough information for you to be able to be in a position to make a decision one way or the other. But certainly if there's any follow-up questions that people might have, then feel free to input them via Kira, and I'll try and address them.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening.